The United States is an extraordinary country. It is one of the freest, most prosperous, and most militarily advanced countries to ever exist. Compared to places like China, Cuba, and Venezuela, the United States might as well be paradise. But what differentiates America from these other countries, and how is an American's way of life different from that of a Chinese, Cuban, or Venezuelan citizen? What makes America special? Well, we have the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is centered around the principle of liberty. The founders had just fought an 8-year war opposing the British attempts to impose greater control over the colonies and to make them repay the crown for its defense of them during the French and Indian War. There was an immense amount of stress to create a government that couldn't become anything like the overbearing British government. The founders wanted to do everything they could to restrain the size of the US government. So they used mechanisms such as checks and balances, the Second Amendment, and freedom of speech to maintain an unintrusive, small government. And beyond all of this, the Bill of Rights does something exceptional with individual freedoms. That is, it does not give American citizens any rights. Instead, it states the God-given rights that we, as humans, naturally have. The founders knew that if a government could give its citizens rights, then it could just as easily take them away. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights stop, or at least make it harder to enlarge the government. And when compared to other countries, this is a good thing. For example, let's look over at China. In China, the government is controlled almost entirely by the CCP. Even though Chinese newspapers, websites, and other outlets of information report that China has plenty of checks and balances, reality states otherwise. The Chinese government is exclusively dominated by the CCP, period. They have control over almost every position, from the National Party Congress to the 7-member Politburo Standing Committee. This is because of the lack of checks and balances and the allowance for a large surveillance state in the Constitution. When it comes down to it, China regularly subverts the freedoms supposedly guaranteed in its constitution, citing states' rights or other similar reasons for infringement. According to the US State Department, Uyghur Muslims are not only discriminated against in China, but imprisoned in internment camps. Because of the massive Chinese government and the few checks and balances, there is no liberty there. According to the Heritage Foundation's 2021 Freedom Index, China ranks mostly unfree. This index takes into account factors such as business freedom, government spending, and labor freedom. Even in 1989, during the Tiananmen Square protests, the lack of checks and balances in the Chinese constitution allowed the government to hunt down, assault, and arrest peaceful demonstrators using their military. Without a constitution that adds checks and balances, nothing stops the CCP from constantly infringing on citizens' lives. Next on our list of communist dictatorships is Venezuela. In 2013, Nicolas Maduro was elected as the new president after the death of Hugo Chavez, the former president. In 2015, opposition parties gained control of 2/3 of the National Assembly, threatening Maduro's power. The National Assembly is an organization similar to the House or Senate of the US. In response to this, Maduro forced out Supreme Court justices, replacing them with party members. In 2016, the Supreme Court ruled to strip the National Assembly of its powers. And even though the ruling was reversed eventually, this stoked massive opposition to the party. Once citizens saw how much power Maduro actually had, they became restless. But the protesters and rioters have experienced difficulty due to the previous gun grabs executed by Maduro and Chavez. In 2012, for example, Chavez banned all new sales of firearms except to the police, the military, and certain paramilitary groups that supported his reign. Now, very few Venezuelans own firearms to defend themselves against vast government overreaches. The conflict is still going on today, and Venezuela is still a failed state. Under Chavez, who was also undoubtedly a communist dictator, the economy actually experienced growth. Communism and socialism can work for a short amount of time, but in the end they will always fail. And when evaluating the success of countries or policies, this is a crucial piece of information to remember. Judgment must be withheld until enough time has passed that countries can no longer get by off vast national resources, foreign aid, or the successes of the previous capitalist systems. Nicolas Maduro has committed a plethora of human rights violations and has driven Venezuela's already lacking economy into the ground. But without an assurance to bear arms, there's little Venezuelan citizens can do. Last up, Cuba. Supporters of communism have been, and still are, espousing the wonders of communism, big government, and how the US needs to emulate Cuba. And to some extent, Cuba was doing moderately well, just not for the reasons championed by American intellectuals. Cuba did see economic improvement and better living conditions, but this was primarily due to Soviet aid, not vast government programs and central control. And when the USSR collapsed, Cuba took an economic downturn to rival that of Venezuela. And that's not even to mention the gross human rights violations throughout Fidel Castro's reign. After Castro became prime minister, he declared himself to be dictator for life. When no document guarantees equality under the law so that politicians aren't above it, you get Cuba. A Cuba where you can't buy basic necessities. A Cuba where human rights violations are the norm. A Cuba that can't survive. And is that a Cuba that anyone wants to live in? Because I sure don't. Next, let's look over at Britain. Unlike our other three countries, Britain is generally seen to have many of the same liberties that the US does. It is widely considered to be a first world, free, capitalist society. But it's a little different than the US. According to the Public Order Act of 1986, for example, a citizen can be prosecuted if, quote, he uses threatening, abusive, or insulting words or behaviors or disorderly behavior. Not death threats, not terrorist plans, just speech that the British government happens to not like. And with that definition, it is easy to see governmental officials deeming any speech they don't agree with threatening, abusive, insulting, or disorderly. And it's happened. According to The Guardian, 21-year-old Liam Stacey was sentenced to 56 days in prison after posting a racist tweet about a black soccer player while drunk. He was led away in handcuffs after his hearing, which he had spent sobbing and apologizing. In another instance of a blatant crackdown on free speech, the television show Last Week Tonight was banned because it included a segment about Brexit, which featured footage of the House of Commons debate. The UK has no assurance of free speech, which makes it publicly acceptable to pass laws like the Public Order Act of 1986. There is no clear reason that critics can oppose this act in the UK. In America, it is clearly an infringement on the First Amendment rights guaranteed to all citizens, meaning that opposition has a clear basis on which to argue. The British do not have that privilege. The US Constitution protects our basic human liberties. It makes human rights violations, poverty, and privation the exception, not the norm. It stops America from turning into socialist dystopias like the Soviet Union, like China, like Cuba, like Venezuela, and like all the other failed states that embrace society as a whole over the rights of the individual. It allows us to speak our mind, associate with who we want, and keep and bear arms. And even when the US government does something egregious, such as the Japanese internment during World War II, it never lasts long and grievances are addressed. At its core, the US Constitution makes the government smaller and the individual bigger. And when the individual is bigger, when the individual has more rights, the society as a whole becomes happier, and it makes America exceptional.